In 1960, Martin Seligman had just been minted as a new psychologist, and his first job was at the University of Pennsylvania. They hired him in the psych department to work with undergraduates, and he did a very smart thing. He got permission in that very first year to study the incoming freshmen. Now, University of Pennsylvania, Ivy League school, pretty big school, maybe 1,000 students, and he sent them or gave them in the orientation week a questionnaire that allowed him to put them into 3 main groups. So the first group, if we'll use this, let me use this for a second. The first group were people who were pretty equally balanced between being negative and being positive. So the optimists were over in this end and the pessimists over here. And so he has a group that is on the right side and a group that's on the left side. There's some overlap there. But now he's got these 3 groups. And his purpose was to study how well they did in their freshman year there at the University of Pennsylvania. And that's exactly what they did for those 4 years, back in the days when people used to finish college in 4 years. And they found that one of these 3 groups really outperformed the other 2. That they had a lower dropout rate, that they did better academically, that they did better in leadership positions around the campus. Everything they seemed to measure showed that this one group was ahead of the other 2. Which group do you think it was? Well, it wasn't the balanced group. It was this group. It was the positive, optimistic group that shone in the 4 years. Then Seligman did 2 other things. One was he asked people from those 3 groups if they would stay with him after they left, and he could study them in their careers. And he actually traced them in terms of their careers, in terms of their health over a period of decades. It was actually 30 years that he traced that first group. He also sent them questionnaires periodically as to how much their well-being was, how happy they were, how they felt about themselves. The second really smart thing he did was get permission from the next entering freshman class to do the same thing. So he studied that next group for 29 years and the next group after that for 28, because in 1990, 30 years after the first group, he published his results. And he had had a lot of graduate students working with him on this project. And I'll tell you more about the project in a minute. And the book concluded with enough evidence and enough simple focus on one principle that is now a classic principle and a core principle for all of us. And the principle is that the people who are more positively programmed are going to be more successful in their careers, in their health, in their happiness and feelings of well-being. And when he published the book, he said he thought that they might even live longer, but the actuaries were not willing to sign off on that particular dimension at that point. And so that remained open. I was in a phone class with Seligman in 2002 when the results of the actuaries came in, and the actuaries at that point had had enough years of studying enough people that they said, yep, as a group, this group is likely to live longer than these other 2 groups. Guess how much longer? Actually, 7.2 years longer as a group. Now that's a pretty impressive statistic, folks. That's pretty noticeable. That's like an inch on the end of your nose. I mean, that's really a big chunk of added life. So if the case is made, and as it was made by Seligman, that it's preferable to be more positive and more optimistic, then the question comes up, I hope you're thinking it, where am I on this continuum? And then how do I move in the direction I want to go? So let's look at this continuum for just a second. We know what a continuum is. It's two extreme positions with a bunch of pieces in between those two extremes that are calculated relative to each other. So you could be right in the middle of this continuum where you have equal kind of negative and careful and doubtful thoughts at some point and actions at some point, and positive and optimistic and all the stuff that goes with that at other points. So, how did you get where you are here? Because we all have patterns, and it doesn't mean we never go out of our pattern, but in general, where are we? We're really, they show the evidence shows that you can actually find out where somebody is in this dimension. So how did you get there? Now, there's no single piece of research that shows this. What I'm going to give you now is my opinion about the four major pieces that put you where you are, that put me where I am on this continuum. And these are no particular order, but I think these are the big four. One of them is your life experiences. So when you're born, in those first 5, 6, 7, 8 years, you are pretty much influenced by the school that you go to, the place you live, your economics of your family, and so forth. And it isn't until you get to be on your own, maybe as a teenager beginning, and then after that, that you begin to be able to influence your life experiences. But clearly, life experience is a big one. Another one is genetics. Our genetics have a huge influence on who we are, how we act, how we react, the whole show. A third one is who were your early models? Who were the big people that influenced you most when you were really young, particularly when you were 6, 5, 4, that area? So meaning that if your early models were very pessimistic and negative, that was a huge influence on you, or wherever if the opposite was true, huge influence. And the fourth one is the one that people rarely really think about when I ask this question, how did you get where you are? The fourth one is, how much work have you done on yourself to make you who you want to be, or who you think would be the ideal for you? So we got genetics, we got early models, we got our life experience up to this point, and we've got how much work have you done? Have you decided, for example, I have to have an education and done whatever you needed to do to get there? That has been a big influence on where you are now on this scale. So before we move on, let's look at another interesting question. And that is, who's responsible for those four dimensions? Let me ask, how responsible are you for your genetics? Could we say 0? In other words, you got what you got. Unless you chose your parents, you have some mystical way to do that. But we got our genetics given to us, and that's a huge influence. Secondly, did you choose your early models? Probably not. That's just the route before you begin to take any kind of control at all. And the same thing is true with our life experiences up to a point. So I would guess that we're maybe 50% responsible for our life experiences. It depends how old we are, and 50% we got them handed to us and we simply lived them. How responsible are we for how much work we've done in making us the person we want to be? Well, that's got to be 100%, right? So now, Seligman not only did all of this research about where people are and what their patterns are, they did a lot of research and experimentation with how can you move. So let's look over here. If let's say you're here and you want to move this way because that's where the payoffs are. I'm going to tell you about two things that they did at the University of Pennsylvania in trying to answer that question. First, they recruited a group of, quote, slightly depressed graduate students. And they agreed to be experimented with, and I think there's something like 16 of them, not a huge amount. How did they determine that they were slightly depressed? They gave them a questionnaire which told them that they weren't deeply depressed, not clinically depressed, but just slightly depressed. In fact, when I was in Vancouver a little while ago, somebody in the group said, "Are there any other kind of graduate students than slightly depressed?" Anyhow, these 16 people agreed to be experimental for Seligman and his group, and the first thing he asked them to do was to choose someone in their life whom they appreciated a lot. A person in their life whom they had deep appreciation for. Then they were to write them a letter telling them how they appreciated them and whatever else they wanted to say about how that came about for them. And they had a chance to work on that letter and polish it and then mail it off. Oh, no, sorry, they didn't mail it off. Because the next thing they needed to do was they needed to call the person on the phone and say, "Could I spend an hour or two with you?" By this time, there was a lot of research money behind this project, and so they had enough money to send some people from Philadelphia as far away as Arizona simply to spend this couple hours with the person who they felt so much appreciation for. And the last instruction was, you begin your time with them by simply reading the letter of appreciation that you have written. Which they did, and then of course whatever followed. It wasn't the same for everyone, but there was a lot of rich conversation, I'm sure. And then they came back to Philadelphia. Now, social scientists are pretty skeptical about change until they have a lot of evidence that it's really taken place and that it's not just a happening of the moment. So if you can show change to them in a hardcore way, after 1 month they'll say, interesting. If you can show them that same change is held for 3 months, they'll say, okay. And when you have been able to hold the change for 6 months, they'll finally begin to be really impressed and say, yeah, I think you've got something there that really is a change that seems to be looking like it's going to last. So now, after these 16 slightly depressed graduate students have returned for a month, they gave them the questionnaire again to determine how they were feeling. And sure enough, they were no longer depressed. They were above the line, separating depression from non-depression. After 1 month, they had obviously changed for that period of time at least. They did that again at 3 months, and still the group was above the normal line. The change seemed to be holding. They did it at 6 months, and whoops, the group had slipped as a group down again, being slightly depressed. So what did they conclude about that? They concluded that this was a really good thing to do, but you can't expect it to provide a permanent change. They'd come back and they felt differently about themselves, and they held it for quite a while, but at 6 months something else had happened and slipped back in there. All right, that's the first experiment. So valuable learning, but not as conclusive as they had hoped. The second thing that they tried that worked, because they tried a number of things, and I'm just telling you about these two, they said to another group of slightly depressed graduate students who were willing to experiment, pick a time in the day when you can spend 5 minutes every day. And what we need to have you do in those 5 minutes is we need you to think about in the last 24 hours, think of at least 3 things that you really appreciate. Things that you encountered, things that happened, things maybe that you thought about, that you really appreciated. This is positive thing experiences from that 24 hours. And next, in that 5 minutes, keep a journal for 10 days about what those things were. And if you've got 3 things and you still haven't run out your 5 minutes, add some other things. So it's 5 minutes of thinking about things that you appreciated during the day and recording them. And you only have to do that for 10 days as far as we're concerned. They did that, and a number of students liked the whole process, so they kept recording for a little while longer. When I did it myself, I think I kept the journal for maybe a month, month and a half. And when you're doing that, when you know that there's a time in your day when you're going to need to recall and think about things during your last 24 hours that you really appreciated, of course you begin to go through your day with a little different focus. You know, it might be something as simple as, gee, I really stopped and smelled the flowers outside the dorm and just stood there for a couple of seconds and really enjoyed them. Or I had a conversation on the phone, or I spent some time with a friend, or anything that you would rate as positive. Then the same procedure, after a month, they checked them in terms of how they felt about themselves, how they would rate their well-being. And they were above the line. They checked it after 3 months, they're still above the line. They checked it after 6 months, they're still above the line. So that's a very powerful way to move toward the positive side of your own personal continuum. I have a sticky that I put on my bathroom mirror that says 3 blessings. And that was to remind me, when it's been there now 4 or 5 years, it was to remind me that I'm going to pause. I'm not going to keep the journal, but before I go to sleep, I'm going to recall things from my day that I really appreciated. Because that's going to make me more conscious of those things as I encounter them, probably going to help me seek them out more often, because it's such a powerful and valuable thing to do.